Hey everyone, just a quick PowerPoint presentation for you all. I'm not going to go through this since it's in your week 2 content folder, so you can go through it on your own. You probably hopefully already have. But I just wanted to recap a few quick things as we move away from needs assessments, and I finished grading your discussion board, and you all have a grade entered now. I have some comments made throughout the discussion board. But just to draw our attention to a few points as we kind of move forward, and I begin to now focus on formative and process evaluation discussion boards, and we move into single case design. So again, this is in your week 2 content folder. So ultimately, as you know, needs assessments are designed to understand what clients need, but after having done your peer-reviewed journal article search, you have probably picked up that they vary quite a bit in terms of what they are capable of assessing. So some of them simply ask what clients need. Many of you in your discussion of your own agencies talked about how you will do intakes with clients and ask them about their remaining needs or how they could have been better served. And one of the points that I made was that those can be aggregated then to form a needs assessment at the agency level. But some of the other articles that many of you discussed went above just asking what they need and also looked at gaps in services in terms of comparing what may be available at other agencies, so maybe doing asset mapping, or also looking to secondary sources of data, or some actually went a step further and looked at identified risks and resiliencies in the literature, which is tying us back to our week 1 logic model idea. So the idea that empirically we should have an idea of what some of those risks and resiliencies are that are associated with the identified problem. So we moved in week 1 from a social issue to it being a problem, which is of course identified through our justification of an issue as somehow pathological or having undesirable outcomes in a client or clients' lives. And there are associated risks and resiliencies with any problem that, if targeted, would have an impact on our clients' lives. And that is the purpose of a logic model, is making explicit those implicit links, right? So the idea of, if we target these risks and resiliencies in a certain way, then we would expect to see an outcome in our clients' lives. And so the needs assessment in that way, shape, or form is saying, do these risks and resiliencies exist? Well, we know that they exist empirically in the literature, but do they exist in our population, and to what degree or level of severity? So not only do needs assessments have the capability of assessing need, but then tying that need back to identified risks and resiliencies in the literature. And I'm going to talk a little bit about this quickly using an example from my practice. And then again, just to remind you, the goal is not to generalize. In this class, we're tying research to local contexts. So of course, the research that we read about often aims to generalize, and we use that research extensively through our literature reviews, and then we tie that to local contexts in a culturally competent manner through assessing client need by actually asking our own clients these types of important questions about their risks and resiliencies via surveys, focus groups, interviews, and actually asking them about their opinions too, of course, of their needs and identified gaps in services. They come in lots of shapes and sizes. As I mentioned, I'm not going to go over every slide. This was an important piece that some of you mentioned in the discussion board, that various types of need. So that defined by experts versus that perceived by an individual, that which is expressed, help seeking being an example of that, and that being comparative, which is the most closely tied to the idea of risks and resiliencies. So maybe there are certain youth, for example, that are at risk, and therefore we would identify them as being in need of services. Maybe they have an IEP, for example. Okay. Let you read some of these. Lots of methods to choose from, as you picked up from your peer-reviewed journal article search and review. I'm going to give you a practical example. I worked on the Mexican-American teen relationship study during my dissertation work, actually for 4 years during my entire PhD program. And some stakeholders within the Phoenix Union High School District approached Dr. Leela Williams, who is the principal investigator on this project, some stakeholders from the community, namely the administrator of the Phoenix Union High School District. They were interested in implementing a teen dating violence program in their district, and they were affected by this issue. Counselors had been seeing this issue, parents had been seeing this issue, it was in the media. They were also actually interested in how this may tie to bullying, which is another key area that they were seeing and wanted to affect an outcome. So that was another concern of ours then, is how tied together are these empirically, and how well do the risks and resiliencies share association. So if we target these, would we expect to see a decrease in outcomes, or in both outcomes, so in bullying and in teen dating violence. So involving those key stakeholders and gatekeepers was an important piece. This is just an example of a chart. The gatekeepers being, in this case, the district IRB. So those being the red tape that we need to cut through to actually survey the youth themselves. Getting the consent forms from the parents, of course, was key to this study as well. So how this became a needs assessment really was, is there a problem in this particular area? There at this point was a felt need. There was also at this point an expressed need, or that demand for our services, but this wasn't enough for us as researchers. Of course, we wanted to know, what supportive evidence do we have? So we actually then took the next step in this needs assessment, which many of you also saw from your peer-reviewed journal articles. A first step is often that those interviews with key stakeholders, and then a subsequent step is surveys with often a larger number of those affected by the issue. So at this point, we surveyed teens within the Phoenix Union High School District and used the literature of teen dating violence and bullying to derive the appropriate scales. So, including the right measures, so that we would know what to, what the program should or should not target. And of course, these were derived from the literature. And ultimately, this yielded a study report. This was kept user-friendly. This was then shared with the stakeholders in a focus group format. So we then met with teachers and principals to share the results of the study and found, and the findings, and to get the reaction to the report. And then also, given the unique population, which is another key piece of a needs assessment, is yes, there's lots of literature on teen dating violence interventions and on bullying interventions, but not specific to Mexican American border youth. And that was something, one of the reasons why these interventions weren't just adopted. They were saying, we have a very specific demographic here, so that's why they employed Dr. Williams and subsequently my research in this area to inform let's go back to the drawing board and look at the extent to which there might be unique needs in this population that the intervention should be designed to address. So at this point, we then conducted focus groups divided by level of acculturation among Mexican American youth, which was the population of interest to the needs assessment, asking them questions open-ended. So now we're looking at qualitative research that would mirror those on the quantitative survey instrument. So keep in mind the difference here between quantitative and qualitative research. Qualitative being those open-ended, interviews, focus groups, and quantitative being the survey, those close-ended questions. But both can ask about similar variables and yield very different types of results that then can be compared to one another for very deep understanding of, in this case, how youth handle conflict, how you think about dating violence norms, how culture plays a role in terms of both risk and resiliency to dating violence and bullying, and ultimately a very rich needs assessment, which then drove the design of an intervention, which I'll talk about later in the class. This is just another quick example. I passed this around in class just this last week. This was the very first step of a needs assessment concerning adolescents with disabilities. And like I said, the first step in an exploratory needs assessment is often just talking to key stakeholders. This is just a quote, they don't have anyone else they're talking to. There's no support other than talking to me. This needs assessment is a very first step I'm taking on a separate project looking at the sexual health and disability, the intersection between sexual health and disability. So how are adolescents with disabilities sexual and dating health needs being met by school social workers, and how can we better be training school social workers to meet and address those needs? And this will also entail further and more in-depth needs assessment measures and methods. You watched this and had some very insightful questions and dialogue. So the discussion board, just a few takeaway points. As I mentioned, the difference between qualitative and quantitative. In some of your posts there was some confusion about that. The pair and compare, I like this quick little anecdote in terms of where secondary data sources can come into play with needs assessments. They can be very, very important, but in terms of our research class, one thing I want to drive home is that they should be used as a comparison, very important piece of comparison to local contexts. So in the case of the Matter study that I was just mentioning, we used local surveys to compare to state and national rates of teen dating violence and bullying. So having those, and those are often available through the CDC or Guttmacher Institute, can be a great source of where to go for which measures to even utilize in the first place so that you have a good source of comparison. And then, of course, to contextualize local findings within larger contexts. Concurrent versus sequential designs within mixed methods are sometimes you'll use one method to then inform the next. As I mentioned, the use of surveys to then inform which focus group questions to ask, for example. Other times, both will be conducted concurrently, meaning both at the same time. Always ask yourself these questions when it comes to reading your research articles. What were their research questions? How did they answer them using these methods? And then with this and all future discussion boards, is make sure and ask yourself, is this article appropriate? Most of you did find appropriate needs assessment articles, but it can be very confusing if they're not actual needs assessment articles. And is this peer reviewed? So overall, very great job on your first discussion board. I was very excited to read your critical dialogue. As you move forward on future discussion boards and you have questions, be sure to email me. I'll add your articles to Dr. R's essential resources, especially those that I found particularly relevant. Thank you. Have a great weekend.